Look, you can always find somebody to deny anything. The evidence is just overwhelming. The idea that anybody can, with a straight face, deny that this was a massive sex trafficking scheme.
Michael Tracey calls it a mythology, while David Boies points to overwhelming evidence. That's not a small disagreement. It's a fundamental clash over how truth is handled in public. And here's the contradiction. Instead of engaging the evidence directly, Tracey shifts to attacking figures like Tara Palmeri and David Boies. That's not a legal argument. That's a deflection. Because if the evidence were weak, you wouldn't need to focus so heavily on the people presenting it. Listen closely. This is the tell. David Boies, on the other hand, grounds his position in documented claims, testimony, and legal findings. He's not relying on framing. He's relying on record. That difference matters in any system that values accountability. And this is where democracy meets denial. When the conversation moves from evidence to personal attacks, clarity gets lost. But evidence doesn't disappear just because it's inconvenient.
Because the central tenets of what I've taken to calling the Epstein mythology have simply never been supported by anything close to the degree of credible evidence that would justify the United States, Great Britain, and the world now being embroiled in this gigantic pedophilia crisis where people like Tara Palmeri and your next guest, David Boies, are convincing untold millions that there was some enormous child rape atrocity that was perpetrated and covered up at the highest levels of government. This is crazy-making stuff. And in fact, it wouldn't be surprising if people who come to believe this stuff and might already have a disposition toward mental illness could enter into a kind of homicidal mania. And so Tara Palmeri, I would agree with her in that there is a lot more to investigate on this subject, namely the journalistic malfeasance that's been so shockingly rampant, it's incredible. Tara Palmeri journalistically collaborated with Virginia Giuffre. Didn't just use her as a source or as an inspiration, but essentially shared a byline effectively with her on the podcast series that she produced in 2020. They went around the United States saying they were just innocently on this truth-seeking mission to find out all that Jeffrey Epstein did to all his innocent victims. And they told the listeners, don't worry, none of this is about bringing any further lawsuits or criminal charges against anybody. So all these men we're trying to track down, they have no reason not to speak to us. Meanwhile, about a year or two later, Virginia Giuffre, who, by the way, is one of the most egregious serial fabulists who's ever walked the earth. I know that's really controversial, but all the claims that she had to retract, the trail of destruction she left in her wake, empowered by people like David Boies and Bradley Edwards, who, by the way, if you want to know what the impediment is to full disclosure of the Epstein files, just look at what David Boies' colleague, Bradley Edwards, has been frantically arguing for the past several months in federal courts in the Southern District of New York about the supposed terror and nightmares that have been unleashed if we have the Epstein files released. On the one hand, they're all sloganeering about release the Epstein files. On the other hand, they don't just want to redact the, quote, victims' names. And by the way, what happened to saying alleged victim or purported victim? Virtually none of these people have actually ever been adjudicated as victims. The only criteria that's required by the DOJ to abide by what the frantic victim lawyers are demanding is mere self-identification of victimhood. Does the media make any of this clear? And does the media ever specify that when Pam Bondi is protested, last point, Piers, when Pam Bondi is being protested last week and everybody's going wild saying, oh, all these benighted Epstein victims are standing up and demanding truth and justice, how come it's never pointed out that the vast majority of the people who are visible there, the victims, were adults at the time of their claimed victimization? And yet this is supposed to be some massive pedophile crisis, so David Boies can add to his extortion of the British royal family.
Here's what that really exposes. Michael Tracey doesn't just question the story. He calls it mythology, as if everything documented, investigated, and prosecuted simply doesn't count. That's not skepticism. That's a reframing of reality. And listen closely. This is the tell. Instead of dismantling the evidence, Michael Tracey targets the people behind it. He goes after Tara Palmeri by name. he goes after David Boies, and he calls Virginia Giuffre one of the most egregious serial fabulists who has ever walked the earth. That's not a legal argument. That's character assassination. Here's the contradiction. If the claims involving Jeffrey Epstein and his network were truly weak, they could be challenged on evidence alone. But instead, the focus shifts to discrediting voices like Giuffre, Palmeri, and Boies. That's not about truth. That's about control of the narrative. And then it goes deeper. Michael Tracey suggests that people who believe these accounts could develop homicidal mania. Think about that framing. Concern about documented abuse is being recast as instability. That's not engagement with facts. That's pathologizing the public. We've seen this before. When pressure builds, the focus often shifts from evidence to the mindset of those paying attention. It creates doubt, not about the facts, but about whether you should trust yourself for taking them seriously. And here's another layer most people miss. Tracey points out that many alleged victims were adults at the time, as if that ends the conversation. It doesn't. Legally and morally, coercion, manipulation, and power imbalance don't disappear with age. Courts have recognized that for decades. So that argument doesn't resolve anything. It sidesteps it. And then there's the word choice, extortion. Michael Tracey describes David Boies' legal work not as litigation, but as extortion. That word only works if you assume the claims are illegitimate from the start. It's not neutral. It's loaded. Because if you accept that framing, then every settlement, every claim, every piece of testimony becomes suspect by default. And this is where democracy meets denial. When evidence is met with personal attacks, when concern is labeled instability, and when legal action is reframed as criminal behavior, the goal isn't clarity, it's confusion. But accountability doesn't work that way. Facts don't disappear because they're uncomfortable, and calling something a myth doesn't make documented evidence go away.
And now extort J.P. Morgan for another couple $100 million.
Well, when you say,
just
all
like he did.
right. In relation, look, I'm going to go to Tara to respond to that. It's only fair given you've name checked.
I don't even know.
So aggressively. All I would say, and I'll come to the other two panelists in a moment, all I would say about so-called extortion of the British royal family, the reality is that Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, when he was still Prince Andrew, said he'd never met Virginia Giuffre, certainly never had sex with her on the 3 occasions in different places he was accused to do so. He said the picture of them was fabricated, etc., etc., etc. He also, in a lengthy interview for the BBC, said he never had anything more to do with Epstein after seeing him in Central Park, after his conviction, and so on. All of which turned out to be a load of baloney. At the last minute, rather than have his day in court to clear his name, Andrew paid a cheque reported to be £12 million to Virginia Giuffre, a woman he claimed he'd never met. The picture, we now know from leaked emails by Ghislaine Maxwell in the latest dump of Epstein files, where she said were genuine. That picture was taken, right? And so I'm afraid just on that point alone, I see little extortion and just a bunch of lies from Andrew Mountbatten Windsor to cover his ass. Listening to this, actually,
Piers,
is Virginia Giuffre's. Well, hang on. Mike, I gave you a chance to speak and I've responded. We've got a better person to respond, actually, because I'm now joined by David Boies. David, great to have you back on Uncensored. It's been 6 months since I last spoke to you. So much has happened since then. Right. In relation to what we've just heard from another panel member, which is that Virginia Giuffre was one of the least reliable witnesses imaginable, what is your response to that?
Look, you can always find somebody to deny anything. The evidence is just overwhelming. The idea that anybody can, with a straight face, deny that this was a massive sex trafficking scheme, is between absurd and pathetic. We have the testimony of dozens, many dozens of young women, girls. We have the reports of the police department in Palm Beach. We have photographs, not just the one photograph, but multiple photographs are coming out. We have the emails that set forth at least some of the efforts, including the efforts to bribe witnesses. This is not a close call.
Piers Morgan just did something that does not happen enough. He laid out the contradiction, line by line, with no room to escape. And I need you to follow this carefully because the logic here is airtight. Andrew Mountbatten Windsor said he never met Virginia Giuffre. A photo appeared showing them together. He said the photo was fabricated. He said he had no further contact with Jeffrey Epstein beyond one public sighting. He went on the BBC, one of the most watched news platforms in the world, and repeated all of it. And then, rather than go to court and prove any of it, he wrote a check, reportedly £12 million, to a woman he claimed he had never met. You have to understand what that means from a legal standpoint. You do not pay £12 million to someone you have never encountered if you are confident in your innocence. That is not how litigation works. Historically, when powerful figures faced credible legal challenges and genuinely had a strong case, they showed up, they presented evidence, they did not quietly make it disappear with a sum of money most people will never see in their entire lifetime. And then David Boies walked in, and the moment he said Michael Tracey said this as if Virginia Giuffre was one of the least reliable witnesses imaginable, David Boies responded with, "You can always find somebody to deny anything." That line landed because it is true. Denial costs nothing. Evidence is what actually costs people. Then, David Boies said the idea that anyone can with a straight face deny this was a massive scheme is between absurd and pathetic. Coming from one of the most decorated attorneys in modern American legal history, that is not dramatic language. That is a precise professional assessment. And when someone at that level looks at a case and says this is not a close call, that should stop people in their tracks. Because that man has argued some of the most complex cases in American history. He knows what a close call looks like. And he is telling you this is not one.
The reason that nobody wants to go to court and that people settle has nothing to do with extortion. It has to do with they don't have a case. If somebody has a case, they can stand up and defend themselves. This is a situation in which all of the evidence is on one side. I'm in a lot of cases that that are close cases. One side has a point of view, another side has a point of view. There's evidence on both sides. And you have to make close calls. This is not one of them.
David, in relation to Pam Bondi, the Attorney General, now saying that's it, we've had all the Epstein files that is going to be put in the public domain, notwithstanding the fact we've been told there are 3 million more files which will never see the light of day in terms of being put in front of the public. What is your response to that? Does that in any way constitute full transparency on these files?
Well, it's clearly not full transparency. We haven't begun to have full transparency. We have more transparency, thanks really to Congress. We have more transparency than we've had before. And I think you see in the documents that are now being revealed why people fought so hard, powerful people, rich people, politically connected people, powerful people in business, in politics, fought so hard to keep this evidence secret. There's more evidence there. We know there's more evidence there. They're admitting there's more evidence there. Some of the documents that they have produced refer to other documents that have not been produced. So we know that there's more there. And perhaps Congress, perhaps the courts have got to step in and have got to say to the Department of Justice, do your job, be transparent.
Here's what that really exposes. David Boies shifts the focus away from individuals like Jeffrey Epstein, Virginia Giuffre, or even Andrew Mountbatten Windsor, and towards something much bigger, the system itself. And this is where people usually stop paying attention. But this is the part that matters most. He points out that the Epstein-related documents already released are referencing other documents that haven't been made public. Think about that carefully. The evidence we can see is pointing directly to evidence we cannot see. That's not a theory. That's the paper trail talking. And yet, the Justice Department's position suggests closure, that what's been released is sufficient, that the story is essentially complete. Here's the contradiction. If the documents themselves are signaling there's more, then calling it finished isn't transparency. It's a controlled version of transparency, one that shows just enough to create the impression of openness without fully delivering it. Listen closely. This is the tell. True transparency doesn't leave visible gaps in its own records. When files reference missing pieces, it means the process isn't complete. And when institutions move forward anyway, that raises a deeper question about intent. Now step back for a second. This isn't new. David Boies is pointing to a pattern that shows up again and again in American history. In 1975, the Church Committee exposed intelligence abuses that had been hidden for years, not because agencies volunteered the truth, but because they were forced to. Then, in 1992, the JFK Records Act created an independent review board, specifically because the public no longer trusted agencies to release information on their own. External pressure wasn't just helpful. It was necessary. That's the pattern. Accountability, especially at the highest levels, rarely comes from within. It comes from pressure, legal, political, and public. So when David Boies says Congress or the courts may need to step in and push the Justice Department further, that's not speculation. That's how transparency has worked every time it's actually mattered. And here's the most important part. He's not guessing that more evidence exists. He's saying the government's own documents are admitting it. The institution responsible for transparency is, through its own releases, confirming that it hasn't been fully transparent. That's not a conspiracy. That's a documented contradiction. And this is where democracy meets accountability. Because if powerful people, in business, politics, and law, fought this hard for this long to keep certain records sealed, then the question isn't whether more exists. It's why it's still being withheld. And history gives us a sobering answer. When information is protected this aggressively, it's rarely because it's harmless. So the real question becomes simple and uncomfortable. What exactly are they protecting?